Part of the reason that people go watch anti-heroes and villains is because there's a part of them crying out for the incorporation of the monster within them, which is what gives them strength of character and self-respect, because it's impossible to respect yourself until you grow teeth. And if you grow teeth, then you realize that you're somewhat dangerous, or maybe somewhat seriously dangerous, and then you might be more willing to demand that you treat yourself with respect and other people do the same thing. And so that doesn't mean that being cruel is better than not being cruel. What it means is that being able to be cruel and then not being cruel is better than not being able to be cruel. Because in the first case, you're nothing but weak and naive. And in the second case, you're dangerous, but you have it under control. And a lot of martial arts concentrate on exactly that as part of their philosophy of training. It's like, we're not training you to fight. We're training you to be peaceful and awake and avoid fights. If you're competent at fighting, that actually decreases the probability that you're going to have to fight, because when someone pushes you, you'll be able to respond with confidence. With any luck, a reasonable show of confidence, which is very much equivalent to a show of dominance, is going to be enough to make the bully back off. And so the strength that you develop in your monstrousness is actually the best guarantee of peace.
Need motivation?
Watch a top 10 with Believe Nation.
Hey, it's Evan Carmichael, and I make these videos because in my first business, I struggled to stay afloat. I quit my business partner, and the thing that kept me going was studying the stories of famous entrepreneurs and seeing how they struggled and seeing what they had to overcome and listening to their wisdom and motivation gave me the courage, the strength, the belief to go one more day and see my business through. And in all honesty, I still need the inspiration, wisdom, motivation today for my business too. So today, let's learn from one of the best, Jordan Peterson, and my take on his top 10 rules of success. Enjoy.
There's this old story in King Arthur where the knights go off to look for the Holy Grail, which is either the cup that Christ drank out of at the Last Supper or the cup into which the blood that gushed from his side was poured when he was crucified. The stories vary, but it's basically a holy object, like the phoenix in some sense, that's a representation of transformation. So it's an ideal, and so King Arthur's knights, who sit at a round table because they're all roughly equal, go off to find the most valuable thing, and where do you look for the most valuable thing when you don't know where it is? Well, each of the knights looks at the forest surrounding the castle and enters the forest at the point that looks darkest to him. And that's a good thing to understand, because the gateway to wisdom and the gateway to the development of personality, which is exactly the same thing, is precisely through the portal that you do not want to climb through. And the reason for that's actually quite technical. This is a Jungian presupposition too, is that, well, there's a bunch of things about you that are underdeveloped, and a lot of those things are because there's things you've avoided looking at because you don't want to look at them, and there's parts of you you've avoided developing because it's hard for you to develop those parts. And so it's by virtual necessity that what you need is where you don't want to look, because that's where you've kept it. And that's why there's, an idiosyncratic element of it for everyone. Your particular place of enlightenment and terror is not going to be the same as yours, except that they're both places of enlightenment and terror. So they're equivalent at one level of analysis and different at another. So anyways, back to fiction and what it does. It distills truth, and it produces characters that are composites, and the more they become composites, the more they approximate a mythological character, and so they become more and more universally true and more approximating religious deities. But the problem with that is they become more and more distant from individual experience. And so with literature, there's this very tight line where you need to make the character more than merely human, but not so much of a god that, one of the things that happened to Superman in the 1980s, Superman started out, he's got a heavenly set of parents, by the way, and an earthly set of parents, and he's an orphan like Harry Potter. Very common theme is that when Superman first emerged, he could only jump over buildings, and maybe he could stop a locomotive, but by the time the 1980s rolled around, like, he could juggle planets and, swallow hydrogen bombs, and, he could do anything. Well, people stopped buying the Superman comics because how interesting is that? It's like something horrible happens and Superman deals with it. and something else horrible happens and Superman deals with it. And it's like, that's dull. He turned into such an archetype. He was basically the omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent God. And that's no fun. It's like God wins, and then God wins again, and then again God wins, and So then they had to weaken him in different ways with kryptonite, So green kryptonite kind of made him sick, and red kryptonite, I think, kind of mutated him, if I remember correctly. And anyways, they had to introduce flaws into his character so that there could be some damn plot. And that's something to think about, There's a deep existential lesson in that your being is limited and flawed and fragile. You're like the genie, which is genius in the little tiny lamp, this immense potential, but constrained in this tiny little living space, as Robin Williams said when he played the genie in Aladdin. But the fact that you have limitations means that the plot of your life is the overcoming of those limitations, and that if you didn't have limitations, well, there wouldn't be a plot, and maybe there would be no life. And so that's part of the reason why perhaps you have to accept the fact that you're flawed and insufficient, and live with it and consider it a precondition for being. It's at least a reasonable idea.
Rule number 2 is stop lying.
One thing I did in 1985, 82, 83, 82, I swore that I would stop lying. I said, I'm going to try not to say anything I know to be untrue. That doesn't mean I swore to tell the truth, because truth, that's hard. But you can consciously stop lying when you know you're lying. You can stop doing that. And that has been revolutionary for me. And one of the things I've really realized in recent years, and this is very much worth knowing, is that many times when people speak to each other, they have an agenda in mind. You want something from someone, maybe you want a job, and you want to craft your image to get the job, right? So you say what you need to say to get what you think you need. The problem with that is, what do you know about what you need? You're so accurate about that, are you? And you think you know what you need exactly, and so you're going to falsify your utterances to bring about the desired end, and you're going to use the other person as a target of your manipulation. Well, that's like you write an essay because that's what the professor wants to hear. It's like, you don't do that, because you don't falsify your words, because hypothetically they're divine, and the whole stability of the state rests on them, hypothetically, and maybe really too. And so you don't do that. And so instead you strive to tell the truth, and maybe that's an aim too. And then it's an adventure, because I'll tell you one thing, if you tell the truth, you have no idea what's going to happen to you. Because you have to let go of that. It's like, I'm going to say what I think, and then what I'm going to assume, faith, I'm going to assume that whatever happens, if I am telling the truth, is the best thing that could happen, because the truth brings about what is best. And even if it looks hard for me, because it might be, because people take the easy way out often when they lie, even if it looks bad for me, that doesn't mean it's bad. It just means I don't see the whole picture. And if you believe that the truth will set you free, and that there is such a thing as the truth, and that the truth is redemptive, then you're pretty much stuck with that conclusion. But one of the remarkable things about that, and this really is worth knowing, is that if you do that, you will have your adventure. Right? That's the Abrahamic adventure, the call from God that justifies your life because of the excitement of what you're doing. And the truth does that. And then if it's the truth, man, it's your adventure. Because what bloody adventure are you having if you tell someone else's story? It's not yours. And maybe if it's not yours, it's not good enough for you. And then you suffer, and then you're bitter, and then you're cruel, and then you're resentful. That's not good, or you get arrogant. So you break up your life, into practicalities, your career, your education, your intimate relationship, your marriage, your friendship. Hopefully your intimate relationship and your marriage are the same thing. Your use of time outside work, your civic duty, and you develop an image for yourself, a vision for yourself on all those fronts, and assume that you can have, with the proper sacrifices, what you need and want. And then I'll say something interesting about that, because that's the pursuit of goods in a practical way, right? And what's valuable in a practical way, in an implementable way. And you pick those pathways and you dedicate yourself to their optimization along any of those axes. And then you learn to optimize an aim. And then you see, once you've learned to optimize an aim across a set of goods, you start to aim at what unites those goods. Because that's what makes goods good. It's whatever is common across a set of goods. That's the highest good or a higher good. And so by practicing any good in any rigorous sense and making the proper sacrifices in that direction, you simultaneously learn to approach the good that is the sum or the essence of all those proximal goods. And I would say that the essential insistence in Christianity is that the good that unites all those goods is the same good that's reflected in the image of Christ, which is an image of acceptance of the suffering of life and the necessity of serving the lowest as the highest calling. And that's something, and it might be true, like really, actually, 100% true, more true than anything else, and I actually think it is, partly because the freest societies that we have, that the world's ever known, the more successful societies, are predicated on precisely that idea as an unshakable foundation, a self-evident truth in the case of your country. And so it might be true, and if it is true, and if that is real, then why in the world would you ever attempt to do anything else? And it's kind of earth-shattering in some sense to take this with real seriousness, you know. It's all very frightening if you're not afraid of that vision, you know, and what it implies for you and your soul, then you didn't understand it. But it's also an unbelievably, what would you say, endlessly promising vision of what your life could be. And you know, you might think, well, I need a life so rich that I can justify its suffering. And that's really asking for something, because there's no shortage of suffering in life. And no one thinks their own suffering isn't real. And maybe there's a possibility that there's some aim that's so high that the attempt alone to move in that direction is of sufficient value to act as a panacea for the suffering. And so you could say at the end of your life, oh my God, that was so hard. It was worth it. And so that's the choice you make at the crossroads, if you have any sense.
Rule number 3 is find your niche.
The more accurate a measure you take of someone's political beliefs, the more you find that personality is what's predicting them. And I think that's a reasonable thing to think about, because, you know, you have to figure out ways of simplifying the world, right? Because you just can't do everything. And so people are specialized. They have specialized niches that they occupy. You could think about them as social niches. Like a niche is a place where your particular skills would serve to maintain you. And so if you're extroverted, you're going to look for a social niche because you like to be around people. And if you're introverted, you're going to spend much more time on your own. And so if you're an introverted person, for example, you're going to want a job where you're not selling and where you're not surrounded by groups of people who are making social demands on you all the time, because it'll wear you out. Whereas if you're extroverted, that's just exactly what you want. And so the extrovert sees the world as a place of social opportunity, and the introvert sees the world as a place to retreat from and spend time alone. And it turns out that both of those modes of being are valid. The issue, at least to some degree, is whether or not you're fortunate enough to match your temperament with the demands of the environment, and I suppose also whether you're fortunate enough so that you're born in an era where there actually is a niche for your particular temperament, because it isn't necessarily the case that that will be the case. Imagine that all of these temperamental dimensions vary because of evolutionary pressure, right? So there's a distribution of extroversion, a normal distribution. Most people are somewhere in the middle, and then as you go out towards the extremes, there are fewer and fewer people. And what that means is that on average, across large spans of time, there have been environments that match every single position on that distribution, with most of the environments matching the center, because otherwise we wouldn't have evolved that way. And so sometimes being really extroverted is going to work well for you in a minority of environments, a minority of niches, and sometimes it's just going to be a catastrophe. I suspect, for example, that if you live in a tyrannical society where any sign of personally oriented activity is likely to get you in trouble, that being extroverted and low in neuroticism wouldn't be a very good idea, because you're going to be mouthy and happy and saying a lot of things, unable to keep your thoughts to yourself, and you're going to be relatively fearless. Now, I don't know that for sure, because we haven't done the studies that precisely match temperamental proclivity to environmental demand, but you get what I mean.
Rule number 4 is be grateful.
Young people always have a reason to be upset and cynical about the current state of affairs, and it's that way forever. And so it's useful, I think, to consider such considerations or such conceptualizations as the patriarchy in that light, because it's an archetypal truth that the social structure is corrupt and incomplete. And what that means is that it's something that you have to contend with every moment in some sense of your life. It's a permanent fact of existence. And to be upset that the structures, the social structures, or even the biological structures within which we live are incomplete and imperfect, to take that personally, that's the worst part of it. To take that personally is a misreading of the existential condition of humankind, because it's always the case that what you have been given and what you live in is degenerate and corrupt and in need of repair. And it's easier just to accept that, because there's also a positive element, and the positive element is, well, you've been granted something rather than nothing, and maybe you haven't been granted pure hell, because especially in a culture like ours where many things actually function quite well, so there's room for gratitude there. Even if it's a broken machine, it's not one that's completely devastated, and it's not absolutely hell-bent at every second on your misery and destruction. And it easily could be, because many societies are like that. And so the fact that we happen to live in one that isn't corrupt beyond imagining is something to be eternally grateful for.
Also, to make sure you're actually taking action after watching this video, I've designed a special free worksheet just for this video. The worksheet will highlight all of the lessons learned in this video, as well as pull out our 3 favorite learnings and quotes that will inspire you to actually do something. The worksheet will also give you space to write down what your key takeaways are and your specific plan of action to make sure you're getting results. If you want the worksheet designed specifically for this video, absolutely for free, there's a link in the description below. Go click on it and start building the momentum in your life and your business. I'll see you there. Rule number 5 is don't be resentful.
You mentioned earlier that at times you're boiling inside. I certainly have experienced that personally. Now, anger, how would you distinguish, and I sort of intuitively know these are different, but I would struggle to maybe on the spot separate the two, anger and resentment, because one of your quotes that I have here in front of me with my notes is consult your resentment. It is revelatory. And I'd love to unpack that. But if you could walk us through.
Yeah, well, in my new book, I have a chapter, which is Rule 11. Do not allow yourself to become resentful, deceitful, or arrogant. It's kind of the evil triad as far as I've been able to determine. Resentment in particular. It's bad. It's a bad emotion. It's useful. You can learn a lot by noticing that it occurs. Resentment tells you one of 2 things. One is that that someone's treading on your territory and something needs to be done about it, or that you need to grow the hell up and stop complaining. And it's hard. It isn't necessarily obvious when you feel resentful which of those it is. But you need to figure it out, because you can harbor resentment for unlived life for very, very long period of time. And all it does is corrupt you. It hurts you. It hurts you physically because it's a stressful emotion. Anger is a stressful emotion. Because your body hyper prepares for action if you're angry, because you might get into conflict. And that's a dangerous situation. And so you burn off a lot of psychophysiological resources in anger. If you're resentful, there's probably something you need to say. There's certainly something you need to figure out. And so you can
you can use it as a guide to further development. It's very much useful to aim at a resentment-free existence. And that means, I suppose, that you're taking up enough space. There's always a struggle between your domain and the domain of other people. Everyone competes for everyone else's attention. Everyone competes for everyone else's time. You compete for your own time. And if you're resentful, it's highly probable that, well, as I said, either you're not standing up for yourself sufficiently, or someone is legitimately on your case, in which case you need to do something about that. Or, live with the consequences, which is very unpleasant. It's not optimal. Sometimes I suppose it's unavoidable. But, generally there's something that can be done about it. Maybe you need a new job.
Rule number 6 is value your time.
I don't know what percentage of human effort is spent in counterproductive activity. I'm not an absolute cynic about that, but I mean, when I talk to undergraduates, I ask them, how much time do you waste every day by your own reckoning? And it's somewhere between 5 and 8 hours. It's a lot of time. Well, I usually walk the students through an economic analysis of that. I said, well, why don't you value your time at $50 an hour and calculate for yourself just exactly what you're doing to your future by your inability to discipline yourself. It's worth thinking through. In any case, people do waste a lot of time, and they also act counterproductively a lot of the time.
Rule number 7 is elevate your reputation.
How do we, as human beings, think about reputation? And does reputation even matter anymore if anyone can try to tear your reputation down? Should we be focused on having a good reputation?
Yes.
And how do we protect
but you should be more focused on deserving a good reputation.
What does that mean?
Don't do things you know to be wrong.
And even if
don't lie.
Yeah.
Don't lie. Don't be careless.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if you're. See, I'm fortunate, I suppose. I put all my lectures online. So virtually everything I've ever said to a student is, obviously not, but a non-biased sample of everything that I've ever said to students is available. Well, it hasn't come back to bite me.
Right.
And that's hundreds of hours. Why? Well, because I've been fortunate enough not to have said anything fatal.
Mm-hmm.
And, maybe that's because I'm careful with my words.
Rule number 8 is be ethical.
Canada had a good run. The United States had a good run. But sustaining free societies across the decades and across the generations is just too hard for human nature to bear. No, you're not supposed to agree with that.
Well, two things. The first thing is that man does not live by bread alone. So that's the first rejoinder. And the second is, with regards to difficulty, well, the only thing more difficult than contending forthrightly with existence is failing to do so. I'm not suggesting for a moment that this isn't difficult. Part of what the Western religious tradition has done, and religious traditions in general, to some degree, is to try to provide people with support from what's divine in their incalculably difficult efforts to deal with the unknown, let's say, the unknowable. That if you orient yourself ethically in the most fundamental sense, then in some sense you have the force of God on your side, and then maybe you can prevail despite the difficulty. And I think that's right. I think that's true. So, and you can ask yourself, I try to ask these questions seriously, and I would also say that I've been driven to my religious belief, such as it is, by necessity, not by desire. What do you want to have on your side when you're contending with the unknowable future and its vagaries? How about truth? How about beauty? How about justice? You want allies? Those are powerful allies. That's what the university is supposed to be teaching young people. It's like, you need some allies, man. Well, how about the pursuit of truth? Well, then the scientists have their say. And I would say on the economic front, well, how about the free trade between autonomous individuals, the free trade of goods of value between autonomous individuals? That's not such a bad thing to have on your side, these eternal verities. And then we could say, perhaps, that, well, there is a set of eternal verities, but they're all eternal verities, so they share something in common, some good in common. All good things share some good in common. Well, what is the good that they share in common? Well, for all intents and purposes, that's God. And you might say, well, I don't believe in that. It's like, well, I don't know what you mean. You don't believe there's any such thing as good? You don't believe there's any such thing as ultimate good? I'm not trying to make some ontological claim about an old man living in the sky, although I think that's a lot more sophisticated concept than people generally realize. That's not my point. My point is you do have a belief system, whether you know it or not. It's a system of ethics, whether you know it or not. There's either something at the bottom that unifies it, or it's not unified, which means you're aimless and hopeless and depressed and anxious and confused, because those are the only other options. And maybe you don't know what that unifying belief is, but that doesn't mean that it's not there. It just means you don't know what it is. And so I'm trying to puzzle out what it is. You know, I could give you a couple of examples very, very briefly, because I won't. So I already mentioned the Genesis, the story in Genesis. It associates God with the force process that generates habitable order out of chaos and attributes that nature in some sense to human beings. In the next part of the story, in the story of Adam and Eve, God is what people walk with unself-consciously in the garden. So Adam doesn't, because he's now ashamed and he doesn't walk with God anymore. But so what is God? Well, that's what you walk with when you're unself-conscious. So that's an interesting idea. And then you have the God that manifests himself, let's say, in the story of Noah, and that's the intuition that hard times are coming and that you better get your house in order. And you think, well, does that lead you, that intuition? Well, certainly sometimes, if you have any sense, it's like, well, what's the nature of the intuition? Is that a spirit that animates you? Well, obviously, because there you are acting, and so you're acting out a pattern. It's a spirit that animates you. And then there's the story of the Tower of Babel. What's God there? Well, God is that which you replace at your peril, because everything will come tumbling down. That's the Tower of Babel. It's like, well, is that true or not? You think about that for a week, especially in that light. You think, oh, definitely, if we put the wrong thing at the top, like Stalin, for example, then look out. And we've done that a bunch of times in the 20th century. I think, Milton conceptualized Lucifer as something like the spirit of unbridled intellectual arrogance. It's something like Lucifer is the light bringer, and he is engaged in a conflict with God, attempting to replace the divine. And that's pretty explicit in the story. And I look at that and I think, oh, that's a poetic intuition of the battle between the secular intelligentsia and the religious structure. That's Milton's prodroma. And what he sees happening is the intellect has become so arrogant that it will attempt to replace the divine and rule over hell. I think, yeah, well, that's the Soviet Union, man. That's Maoist China. We know. We've got our theory. It's total. We've solved the problem and nothing's going to change. Fair enough. If you want to rule over hell, and you think, well, these societies are successful. It's a pretty odd definition of success as far as I'm concerned. You want to be successful like China? That's why it's true that man does not live by bread alone, A wealthy slave, that's no life, man.
Rule number 9 is do your duty.
In this time of conflict around culture, how can people come together to oppose real power, real corrupt power at the level of the state and the corporation, to make them accountable and to create new models and systems?
Well, I think that one of the things that's happened is that people, ordinary people, let's say, have not fulfilled their civic responsibility in the proper manner. So I think what's happening, Russell, is that we're transforming our society into a literal Tower of Babel. And so a Tower of Babel is an abstract enterprise designed to replace God, to reach to the heavens, to become totalitarian. And its fundamental nature is the aggregation of power and responsibility at the top and the atomization of the citizenry. And that happens when the citizens abandon their intermediary responsibilities. And so in this seminar on Exodus that I just conducted, we talked about the principle of subsidiarity. Now, this is what happens in Exodus, and it's very much worth delving into briefly, if we can do that. So Moses leads these slaves out of Israel. And everyone in the modern world thinks that's a hell of a good idea, because you shouldn't be a slave and you shouldn't be a tyrant. And so we can think of that as a self-evident axiom. In some sense, you should be free. So you have to remove yourself from the tyranny of your own imagination, and you have to remove yourself from the tyranny of state actors. But the problem is, when you remove yourself from tyranny, is you don't get to the promised land. You go to the desert. And that's because everything falls apart around you when you drop your tyrannical presuppositions. And so then you're lost and aimless and fractionated. And so that's the situation that confronts Moses when he leads his people into the desert. They're not free. They're in the desert. They're just wandering aimlessly. And that's the position we're in right now. Now, what happens is that because the Israelites have no tradition of freedom and no internal order, they start fighting amongst themselves. And that's also what happens in the Tower of Babel. When people are too fractionated, they become unable to communicate and they all start speaking a different language. And that's certainly happening at the moment. And so Moses sets himself up as judge to adjudicate all the conflicts that the Israelites find themselves embroiled in the desert. And so now he's sitting from dawn until midnight every day, doing nothing but listening to people fighting. And he does this for years. And then his father-in-law comes along. He's a Midianite priest, so he's the archetype of the ethical outsider, a very common kind of character in the Old and New Testaments, like the Good Samaritan. And Jethro comes to Moses and he says, look, man, you got to stop doing this. And Moses says, why, essentially? And Jethro says, look, there's two reasons. First of all, you're wearing yourself to a frazzle. Nobody can take on that much responsibility and live. And second, you're denying the Israelites their destiny, and basically you're setting yourself up as an alternative Pharaoh in the desert by taking all the responsibility onto yourself. And so then he says, well, they decide, well, what should we do as an alternative? So this is the question is, what's the alternative to tyranny and slavery? And Jethro tells Moses, divide the Israelites into groups of 10 and have each of the 10 nominate a leader, and then group the leaders together and have them nominate a leader and make an intermediary hierarchy up to tens of thousands. And then allow them to adjudicate their own disputes at the most local level possible. And any disputes that can't be intermediated at those local levels that eventually trickle up to you, you can decide. And so this is a hierarchy of responsibility as an alternative to slavery and tyranny. And it's also the model for the later establishment of religious institutions. And so what do people have to do? They have to find a mate. They have to get married. They have to have a family. They have to engage in civic activity. They have to sit on their school boards. They have to run for local office. They have to join a business organization. They have to join a political party. Because imagine this, every bit of social responsibility you abdicate will be vacuumed up by a narcissistic tyrant. That's what will happen. That's what will happen. Those people are just waiting for that responsibility to be transferred into their power.
And rule number 10, the last one before some very special bonus clips, is find real happiness.
What makes Jordan happy? And when was the last time you had the longest stretch of happiness? What caused it? Those two questions, I'm curious.
Oh, I had a lot of happiness, I would say, when I was on tour.
Okay.
It was unbelievably exciting. I had some health problems during that period of time too. So
Sure.
There was a shadow there, but that made me happy on a continual basis. It was unbelievably exciting and engaging. I mean, people are happy when they're pursuing something that they find meaningful, deeply meaningful, especially when that's going well. On a day-to-day level, I find most of my happiness, I would say, in engaging conversation, that's for sure, but also with my family. And, that's partly why I said what I did say when in that clip that you showed earlier. what makes me most happy right now is when my family gets together. So that's my immediate family, my wife, my kids, and their spouses. And there's there's nothing buried underneath the rugs, and everyone's joking and laughing and playing. And it's peaceful. It's truly peaceful. And that does happen. I go to see my son quite often. He lives just up the street from me, fortunately enough. And I really like his wife, and Jillian is her name. And Jillian and my wife, Tammy, have really tried to make their relationship, to perfect their relationship, to get rid of any, of the cliched mother-in-law, daughter-in-law trouble. And some of that was there to begin with. And they both decided, and I suppose we all decided consciously as a unit, that we were going to get rid of all of that and just stop it and try to have a really good relationship. And that really worked. And so now I go over there, and they're happy, they're smiling, it's peaceful there. Their little boy is laughing. He's playing with laughing. And so we had some people over for Easter dinner, my son and his wife and a couple of friends of theirs. And they had a little baby named Florence. And she was also the same age, and she was playing with laughing. So she would go, ha, 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 ha. And then my grandson, Elliot, would go, ha, 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 ha. And then all the adults would laugh because these two infants were actually having a conversation with each other, a proto-conversation with laughter. That lasted for about 10 minutes, and everyone was laughing about it. And well, there isn't anything better than that when there isn't all sorts of horror hidden underneath the carpets. In this new book, Beyond Order, I have a chapter called Don't Hide Things in the Fog. And it's about this. It's like wonderful things can happen if you straighten out everything that's hidden in a family and get it out in the open. And then you have the opportunity then for some real peace and some real joy. And certainly that's at the moment where it's in those interpersonal interactions that I derive a lot of my happiness. And that's been life-saving. And then, of course, this active, engaged intellectual conversation, the sort of conversation that we're doing our best to have, that's also, and the fact that I can share that with so many people, and the responses are so positive. It's wonderful. It's amazing. I can't believe it.
The next best predictor of lifetime success is conscientiousness. Well, and of the two aspects of conscientiousness, say orderliness and industriousness, the better predictor is industriousness. So the question is, well, what can you do about your industriousness? And the answer to that is, well, that's kind of rough too, because there's a strong genetic component. But you can work on micro habits with regards to your conscientiousness. And I think the best micro habits, this is partly to do with this future authoring program processes, I think the best thing you can do with regards to your conscientiousness is to set up some aims for yourself, goals that you actually value. And the future authoring program helps people do that. And basically, it does a situational analysis it helps you do a situational analysis of your life more than a psychological analysis, I would say. And so the questions are something like, well, all right, you're going to have to put some effort into your life. And you need to be motivated to do that. And so what are the potential sources of motivation? Well, you could think about them in the big five manner. If you're extroverted, you want friends. If you're agreeable, you want an intimate relationship. If you're disagreeable, you want to win competitions. If you're open, you want to engage in creative activity. If you're high neuroticism, you want security. Okay, so those are all sources of potential motivation that you could draw on, that you could tailor to your own, your own personality. But then there are dimensions that you want to consider your life across. And so we ask people about, well, if you could have your life the way you wanted it in 3 to 5 years, if you were taking care of yourself properly, what would you want from your friendships? What would you want from your intimate relationship? How would you like to structure your family? What do you want for your career? Well, how are you going to use your time outside of your job? And how are you going to regulate your mental and physical health, and maybe also your drug and alcohol use? Because that's a good place to auger down, because alcoholism, for example, wipes out, 5 to 10% of people. So you want to keep that under control. And then so maybe you develop a vision of what you would like your life to be, and that associates the goal. Well, once the goal is established, and then you break down the goal into micro processes that you can implement, the micro processes become rewarding in proportion, in relation to their causal association with the goal, and that tangles in your your incentive reward system. You know, we talked about the dopaminergic incentive reward system, and that's the thing that keeps you moving forward. And the way it works is that it works better if it produces positive emotion when it can see you moving towards a valued goal. Okay, well, what's the implication of that? Better have a valued goal, because otherwise you can't get any positive motivation working out. And so the more valuable the goal, in principle, the more the microprocesses associated with that goal start to take on a positive charge. And so what that means is, well, you get up in the morning and you're excited about the day, you're ready to go. And so as far as I can tell, what you do is you specify your long-term ideal. Maybe you also specify a place you want to stay the hell away from so that you're terrified to fail as well as excited about succeeding, because that's also useful. You specify your goal. You do that in some sense as a unique individual. You want to specify goals that make you say, oh, if that could happen as a consequence of my efforts, it would clearly be worthwhile. Because the question always is, why do something? Because doing nothing is easy. You just sit there and you don't do anything. That's real easy. The question is, why would you ever do anything? And the answer to that has to be because you've determined by some means that it's worthwhile. And then the next question might be, well, where should you look for worthwhile things? And one would be, well, you could consult your own temperament. And the other would be, well, you kind of look at what it is that people accrue that's valuable across the lifespan. So you do a structural analysis of the subcomponents of human existence, and I already did that. You need a family, you need friends. Like, you don't need to have all these things, but you better have most of them. Family, friends, career, educational goals, plans for, you know, time outside of work, attention to your mental and physical health, etc. You know, that's what life is about. And if you don't have any of those things, well, then all you've got left is misery and suffering. So that's a bad deal for you. So once you set up that goal structure, let's say, and that's really in many ways that's what you should be doing at university. That's exactly what you should be doing, is trying to figure out who it is that you're trying to be, right? And you aim at that, and then you use everything you learn as a means of building that person that you want to be. And I really mean want to be. I don't mean should be, even those things are going to overlap. And it's important to distinguish between those, because that's partly, and this is back down to the micro routine analysis. So as I was saying, well, you're going to try to make yourself more industrious. Okay, number one, specify your damn goals, because how are you going to hit something if you don't know what it is? That isn't going to happen. And often people won't specify their goals too, because they don't like to specify conditions for failure. So if you keep yourself all vague and foggy, which is real easy, because that's just a matter of not doing as well, then you don't know when you fail. And people might say, well, I really don't want to know when I fail because that's painful. So I'll keep myself blind about when I fail. That's fine, except you'll fail all the time then. You just won't know it until you've failed so badly that you're done. And that can easily happen by the time you're 40. So I would recommend that you don't let that happen. So that's willful blindness, right? You could have known, but you chose not to. Okay, so once you get your goal structure set up, you think, okay, if I could have this life, it looks like that might be worth living, despite the fact that it's going to be, you know, anxiety provoking and threatening, and there's going to be some suffering and loss involved in all of that. Obviously, the goal is to have a vision for your life such that, all things considered, that justifies your effort.
You have to make a decision in your life. And this is a decision. And I would say that it's a voluntary element of faith, because it isn't exactly evidence-based. It's more like something you decide before you even look at the evidence. It's more like you decide to stake your life on this. Like, you know, if you decide to get married to someone, you don't really do it on the basis of the evidence that you're going to have a happy life, because you don't have that evidence. You do it. You decide that you're going to make a happy life with this person and that it's worth the risk. So you get married as an expression of faith. Okay, and so faith doesn't mean believing things that no one with any sense would believe. Faith sometimes means putting a stake in the sand and saying, here's where I stand in some sense regardless. And you do that when you get married. You do that maybe when you pledge allegiance to a friend. You have a best friend and you want to maintain that friendship as long as you possibly can. It's a decision of faith. Maybe you do that when you decide a career, when you go to university, because you could have done something else, right? But you chose that. So that's where you put your faith. And like I said, that doesn't mean believing what no reasonable person would believe. Okay, so back to God is love. Well, I'm going to talk about being first instead of God. And being is the totality of experience. That we're going to define it that way for the purposes of this discussion. Being is what there is instead of nothing. And you experience that as a conscious creature. Being is what you experience as a conscious creature. It includes all your emotions, all your motivations, all your subjective experience, as well as everything that's objective. Okay, so it seems to me that all things considered, it's a useful move of faith to act as if you love being. And if you love something, then you want the best in it to flourish. And so maybe you decide deep in your soul that it would be better for you to act towards an end that makes everything that's good better. That's the best way to live, to make everything that's good better. And maybe to restrict the development of everything that's malevolent and evil within yourself and in the broader world, insofar as you're able to do that. And so I think that's an expression of love, is that because when you love something, you care for it. And the proper attitude towards being, I think, is care. And so that's one element of God is love. God being analogous in some way to being. Now, we could look at God more classically as the creator of being. If you assume being is good, well, it's not much of a leap to assume the creator of being is good. And maybe you adopt an attitude towards the creator of being, and that's also love. And you open your heart to existence. And maybe that's the most effective means of having existence open its heart to you. So, for example, if you love other people, you want the best for them, you want the best in you to serve the best in them. If you love them and you trust them courageously, so you open yourself up to them, I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that that's how you elicit the best from them, the best that can be elicited. You're going to get hurt sometimes and betrayed, but that's going to happen no matter what approach you take. I think that's the most effective approach. And that is perhaps the most effective approach to existence per se, to approach it with love and courage. And so that's how that looks to me. Is it a feeling like loving a person? Yes, I think it is. I think it is a feeling like loving a person. It's the generalization of that care that you would have for a child, your brother, your sister, a family member. It's the generalization of that to the broader domain of existence, to broader domains of existence. And I think that's a skill in some sense, right? I mean, if you're good at loving and caring for your family, but you can expand that outward so that more people are brought under that umbrella, then, well, assuming you can manage that, it's very difficult. It seems to me that that's laudable. It seems to me that we spontaneously admire and would like to imitate people who are capable of that. And so you see that when you have a job or you encounter a boss who takes you under his or her wing and helps develop you, or you find a teacher who's particularly inspiring, or you work for an entrepreneur who's inspiring and who also opens doors for you. They're acting with love, as far as I'm concerned. They want the best in them to serve the best in you. And that's very, very motivating for everyone. And that's the proper basis of our social relationships, not power, for God's sake. So can love balance out the crushing responsibility? That's a sophisticated question. I don't know the answer to that. Love is warmer than responsibility. Love is part of empathy and agreeableness. It's a different dimension than responsibility, which is more part of conscientiousness and sort of a cold virtue. I don't know if it balances out the crushing responsibility, but I think it's the emotional analog to the crushing responsibility. Right? So maybe there's love and duty, and they run parallel in if you're an ethical person. That's not all there is to ethics, but love and duty, they're important, and maybe they're better together than they would be as independent entities.
It was the night before we were putting drywall in our house. We were redoing a house, and he had put in all the plastic piping, and I was going to test the joints. They're supposed to be glued together with this pipe glue, right? And I told him I had to test the joints, and he said, well, you don't have to test my joints. They never leak. And I thought, yeah, That's okay. How about if I test them? So I went up on the 3rd floor and filled the pipes with water, capping them in the basement like you're supposed to. And like half an hour later, I had 2 inches of water in the basement. There were 30 leaking joints. And that was the night before the drywallers were supposed to show up. So he wasn't particularly competent. That's the point of that story. But even more so, he had put a bunch of the plastic pipe outside where the drywall would be, so it would have been sticking through the wall. So I spent a frenetic night, sawing through plastic pipe and re-gluing joints so that the drywallers could come in. What's the point? If you're going to be a plumber, man, be a good plumber, because otherwise all you do is go out there and cause trouble. We don't need people to cause more trouble. We need people to solve problems. And so you can be a tradesman, and you can make a lot of money as a tradesperson. It's a bloody, reliable, honorable, forthright, productive way of making a living. And there is a hell of a lot of difference between a working man who knows what he's doing and one who doesn't, both in terms of skill and ethics, right? And you work with someone who knows what they're doing, it's a bloody pleasure. They tell you what they're going to do, they tell you how much it will cost, they go and do it, it works, and you pay them. Perfect. Everyone's happy. And that's what happens when you have genuine hierarchies of competence. And so you listen to these panderers of egalitarianism and equity, and they fail to recognize completely that there are differences in rank between people. It's not such a terrible thing, man. Maybe you wouldn't be a great lawyer. Like, it's certainly possible. Most people aren't. But that doesn't mean there isn't something you could be great at. There's lots of hierarchies to attempt to climb, and if you fail in one, go try in another. But the point is, you're still trying to aim for the top, and what the hell are you going to do if you don't try to aim for the top? Flap about uselessly and whine about your life? It's not helpful. It'll just make you miserable. You're not reliable to anyone. You can't help out in a crisis. It's like, so you tell young people, and this is another message for conservatives, like, I don't care what you're going to do, but go out there and make something of yourself for God's sake. Be an honest person and work and get to the top of whatever it is that you want to get to the top of. And stand up for yourself like a respectable human being, and be a bit of a light on the world instead of a blight. And you can tell young people that, and they haven't been told that by anyone now. And so the young men are so hungry for that it's painful to watch. They're so relieved when someone finally comes up and says, hey, you get your act together a bit, discipline yourself, see if you can learn to tell the truth, concentrate on something for a year or two, you could be a bloody world beater. They think, really? That's possible? Wow, that would be interesting. That might make life worth living. It's like, yeah, it might. So why don't you go do it? That's what the damn universities were supposed to be teaching people, and they've forgotten that. I went to Harvard a month and a half. I used to teach there, and I talked to a bunch of students, and I told them, it's not easy to get into Harvard, Like, you're a valedictorian if you're at Harvard. And not only are you a valedictorian, you're way better than most people at least 2 other things, or you don't get in. And so, like, I don't know what the acceptance rate is, like 5%, and believe me, not everybody applies, so it's a very selective school. And so why am I saying that? It's like, these are high quality kids. So I told them what I just told you. It's like, here you are at Harvard. It's like, get yourself educated, man. Read some books, learn to talk, learn to think, make yourself into something. Get the hell out there and make the world that put you here happy that you were put there in that great institution. And they came up to me afterwards and said, God, I wish someone would have told us that when we were in our first year. It's like, Jesus, why didn't someone tell them that? For God's sake, it's supposed to be the greatest university in the world. Is it so difficult to figure that out? At the end of God's creation, describing how order emerges from chaos, or being from potential, there's this strange line, which is probably the most important line that's ever been written in our culture, at the basis of our culture. And that is that men and women are made in the image of God. And what does that mean? Well, if God is that which confronts potential with truth and courage and makes what's good out of potential, that seems to indicate that we have the same faculty. Like, on a smaller scale, we're not omniscient, but we're not bloody well nothing. Our conscience is integrally tied into the structure of being in some manner we don't understand. And it certainly is the case that we take what isn't and turn it into what is. That's something, man. That's quite the trick we've been able to manage. And so we're made in that image. And so what are we supposed to do? Well, that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to type our letters and make our phrases and construct our sentences and build our paragraphs and put our chapters together and make our books and communicate to people and straighten out the damn culture and constrain the malevolence and ignorance that besets each of us and push nature back and extend ourselves out into the unknown and confront the potential that's there in illimitable quantities and make the world better than it could be otherwise. To move it away from hell, and it can certainly become that, and toward heaven to the degree that we can manage that. And that is a good enough goal. That's the thing. You need something, because your life is tough. It's hard. You need something that, you need something to get out of bed for and fight for. And that's something, right? To fight, let's say, against hell and for heaven. That's something to fight for. Especially and if you want to be convinced about this, like read a little bit about hell. Read the Gulag Archipelago, or read Ordinary Men, or read The Rape of Nanking, or read about what happened in Nazi Germany during Auschwitz and all the catastrophes of the 20th century, and see if you believe in hell. And see if you think, well, maybe not having that happen anymore would be a good idea. And then think about maybe that's something you could contribute to. And then it wouldn't have to happen anymore. And that would be a good thing. And God only knows what great things we could manage under such conditions. We're becoming incredibly technologically powerful. And what would it be like if we became equally wise? Well, that would really be something. God only knows what we could manage in the next 20 years or the next 100 years, We're running at 40%, most of us, because we're half in and half out. And it's not surprising because life is difficult. It's like, well, what if you were 90% in or 95% in or all in? Because you're all in anyways, right? It's a life and death game. No one gets out of this. Everyone dies. You might as well commit yourself. And you might as well commit yourself to the highest good that you can attain, because why not? It'll imbue your life with meaning. It's hard, the responsibility's there, but all the meaning's in the responsibility, and that'll make your life better. It'll make your family's life better, and it should make your culture better. Maybe it make the world better. It's like, that'll justify your damn miserable existence at 3 o'clock in the morning when you're wondering what the hell you're doing here. And that's a good thing, because there's going to be days when you're aching and tired and sore, and there's people in your family that are sick, and you're cynical and bitter, and you need a reason to get up, and you think, yeah, well, a little more heaven and a little less hell, maybe I can pull that off today and tomorrow and next week. And that's worth struggling forward for. You don't have to necessarily have done anything wrong for things to get completely out of control. It's a terrifying doctrine. But it's not a hopeless doctrine, because it still says that there's a way forward, there's a pathway forward. And the pathway forward is to adopt a mode of being that has some nobility, so that you can tolerate yourself and perhaps even have some respect for yourself as someone who's capable of standing up in the face of that terrible vulnerability and suffering. And that the pathway forward, as far as the existentialists are concerned, is certainly by the avoidance of deceit, particularly in language, but also by the adoption of responsibility for the conditions of existence and some attempt on your part to actually rectify them. And the thing that's so interesting about that is, two, as far as I'm concerned, and some of this is from clinical experience, if you take people, and I've told you this, and you expose them voluntarily to things that they are avoiding and are afraid of, that they know they need to overcome in order to meet their goals, their self-defined goals. If you can teach people to stand up in the face of the things they're afraid of, they get stronger. And you don't know what the upper limits to that are, because you might ask yourself, like, if for 10 years, if you didn't avoid doing what you knew you needed to do, by your own definitions, right, within the value structure that you've created, to the degree that you've done that, what would you be like? Well, there are remarkable people who come into the world from time to time, and there are people who do find out over decades-long periods what they could be like if they were who they were, if they spoke their being forward.
And they get stronger and stronger and stronger, and we don't know the limits to that. We do not know the limits to that. And so you could say, well, in part, perhaps the reason that you're suffering unbearably can be left at your feet, because you're not everything you could be, and you know it. And of course, that's a terrible thing to admit, and it's a terrible thing to consider, but there's real promise in it, right? Because it means that perhaps there's another way that you could look at the world and another way that you could act in the world. So what it would reflect back to you would be much better than what it reflects back to you now. My experience is with people that we're probably running at about 51% of our capacity. Something, I mean, you can think about this yourselves. I often ask undergraduates how many hours a day you waste or how many hours a week you waste. And the classic answer is something like 4 to 6 hours a day. You know, inefficient studying, watching things on YouTube that not only do you not want to watch, that you don't even care about, that make you feel horrible about watching after you're done. That's probably 4 hours right there. You know, you think, well, that's 25 hours a week, it's 100 hours a month, that's 2.5 full work weeks, it's half a year of work weeks per year. And if your time is worth $20 an hour, which is a radical underestimate, it's probably more like 50 if you think about it in terms of deferred wages. If you're wasting 20 hours a week, you're wasting $50,000 a year. And you are doing that right now. And it's because you're young, wasting $50,000 a year is a way bigger catastrophe than it would be for me to waste it, because I'm not going to last nearly as long. And so if your life isn't everything it could be, you could ask yourself, well, what would happen if you just stopped wasting the opportunities that are in front of you? You'd be, who knows how much more efficient? 10 times more efficient, 20 times more efficient. That's the Pareto distribution. You have no idea how efficient people get. It's off the charts. Well, and if we all got our act together collectively and stopped making things worse, because that's another thing people do all the time, not only do they not do what they should to make things better, they actively attempt to make things worse because they're spiteful or resentful or arrogant or deceitful or homicidal or genocidal or all of those things all bundled together in an absolutely pathological package. If people stopped really, really trying just to make things worse, we have no idea how much better they would get just because of that. So there's this weird dynamic that's part of the existential system of ideas between human vulnerability, social judgment, both of which are major causes of suffering, and the failure of individuals to adopt the responsibility that they know they should adopt. It isn't merely that your fate depends on whether or not you get your act together and to what degree you decide that you're going to live out your own genuine being. It isn't only your fate, it's the fate of everyone that you're networked with. And so, you know, you think, well, there's 9 billion, 7 billion people in the world. We're going to peak at about 9 billion, by the way, and then it'll decline rapidly. But 7 billion people in the world, and who are you? You're just one little dust mote among that 7 billion. And so it really doesn't matter what you do or don't do, but that's simply not the case. It's the wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network. Of course, that's even more true now that we have social media. You'll know 1,000 people, at least over the course of your life. And they'll know 1,000 people each, and that puts you one person away from 1 million, and 2 persons away from 1 billion. And so that's how you're connected. And the things you do, they're like dropping a stone in a pond. The ripples move outward, and they affect things in ways that you can't fully comprehend. And it means that the things that you do and that you don't do are far more important than you think. And so if you act that way, of course, the terror of realizing that is that it actually starts to matter what you do. And you might say, well, that's better than living a meaningless existence. It's better for it to matter. But I mean, if you really ask yourself, would you be so sure if you had the choice? I can live with no responsibility whatsoever. The price I pay is that nothing matters. Or I can reverse it and everything matters. But I have to take the responsibility that's associated with that. It's not so obvious to me that people would take the meaningful path. You know, when you say, well, nihilists suffer dreadfully because there's no meaning in their life and they still suffer. Yeah, but the advantage is they have no responsibility. So that's the payoff, and I actually think that's the motivation. Say, well, I can't help being nihilistic. All my belief systems have collapsed. It's like, yeah, maybe. Maybe you've just allowed them to collapse because it's a hell of a lot easier than acting them out. And the price you pay is some meaningless suffering, but you can always whine about that and people will feel sorry for you, and you have the option of taking the pathway of the martyr, so that's a pretty good deal, all things considered. especially when the alternative is to bear your burden properly and to live forthrightly in the world. Well, what Solzhenitsyn figured out, and so many people in the 20th century, it's not just him, even though he's the best example, is that if you live a pathological life, you pathologize your society. And if enough people do that, then it's hell. Really. Really. And you can read the Gulag Archipelago if you have the fortitude to do that, and you'll see exactly what hell is like. And then you can decide if that's a place you'd like to visit, or even more importantly, if it's a place you'd like to visit and take all your family and friends. Because that's what happened in the 20th century. If you configure your life so that what you are genuinely doing is aiming at the highest possible good, then the things that you need to survive and to thrive on a day-to-day basis will deliver themselves to you. That's a hypothesis, and it's not some simple hypothesis, right? Because what it basically says is, if you dare to do the most difficult thing that you can conceptualize, your life will work out better than it will if you do anything else. Well, how are you going to find out if that's true? Well, it's a Kierkegaardian leap of faith. There's no way you're going to find out whether or not that's true unless you do it. So no one can tell you either, because just because it works for someone else, I mean, that's interesting and all that, but it's no proof that it'll work for you. You have to be all in this game. There is no more effective way of operating in the world than to conceptualize the highest good that you can and then strive to attain it. There's no more practical pathway to the kind of success that you could have if you actually knew what success was. The world shifts itself around your aim, because you're a creature that has an aim. You have to have an aim in order to do something. You're an aiming creature. You look at a point and you move towards it. It's built right into you. And so you have an aim. Well, let's say your aim is the highest possible aim. Well, then, so that sets up the world around you. It organizes all of your perceptions. It organizes what you see and you don't see. It organizes your emotions and your motivations. So you organize yourself around that aim, and then what happens is the day manifests itself as a set of challenges and problems, and if you solve them properly, then you stay on the pathway towards that aim, and you can concentrate on the day, and so that way you get to have your cake and eat it too, because you can point into the distance, the far distance, and you can live in the day. And it seems to me that makes every moment of the day supercharged with meaning. That's how, because if everything that you're doing every day is related to the highest possible aim that you can conceptualize, well, that's the very definition of the meaning that would sustain you in your life. This circumambulation that Jung talked about was this continual, we'll return to this continual circling in some sense of who you could be. You might notice, for example, that there are themes in your life. You know, when you go back across your experiences, you see you kind of have your typical experience that sort of repeats itself. And there might be variation on it, like a musical theme, but it's like you're circling yourself and getting closer to yourself as you move across time. That's the circumambulation. Now, you remember that for a sec, because we'll go back to it. Okay, so imagine that something glimmers before you. It's an interest that's dawning, and you decide, well, first of all, you're paralyzed. You think, well, how do I know if I should pursue that? It's probably a stupid idea. And the proper response to that is, you're right, it probably is a stupid idea, because almost all ideas are stupid. And so the probability that as you move forward on your adventure that you're going to get it right the first time is zero. It's just not going to happen. And so then you might think, well, maybe I'll just wait around until I get the right idea, and which people do, right? So they're like 40-year-old, 13-year-olds, which is not a good idea. And so they wait around until it's waiting for Godot, until they finally got it right. But the problem is you're too stupid to know when you've got it right. So waiting around isn't going to help, because even if the perfect opportunity manifested itself to you in your incomplete form, the probability that you would recognize it as the perfect opportunity is zero. You might even think it's the worst possible idea that you've ever heard of anywhere. Highly likely, highly likely. So you have, Nietzsche called that a will to stupidity, which I really liked. So, because he thought of stupidity as being you have to take it into account fundamentally and work with it. And so
And so you can take these tentative steps on your pathway to destiny, and you can assume that you're going to do it badly. And that's really useful because you don't have to beat yourself up. It's pretty easy to do it badly. But the thing is, it's way better to do it badly than not to do it at all. So you start your path and you think that you're heading, towards your star. And so you go in that direction. And then, because you're here, the world looks a particular way. But then when you move here, the world looks different, and you're different as a consequence of having made that voyage. And so what that means is that now that thing that glimmers in front of you is going to have shifted its location, because you weren't very good at specifying it to begin with, and now that you're a little sharper and more focused than you were, it's going to reveal itself with more accuracy to you. And so then you have to take it's almost like a 180-degree reversal. But it isn't, because, you've gone this far, and that's a long ways to get that far. But that's a lot farther than you would be if you just stayed where you were, waiting. And so it doesn't matter that you overshoot continually, because as you overshoot, even if you don't learn what you should have done, you're going to continually learn what you shouldn't keep doing. And if you learn enough about what you shouldn't keep doing, then that's tantamount at some point to learning at the same time what you should be doing. So it's okay. So it's like this. Now, what's cool about it, though, I think, is that as you progress, the degree of overshooting starts to decline, right? And that we know that there's nothing hypothetical about that. As you learn a new skill, like even to play a song on the piano, for example, you overshoot madly. You're making all sorts of mistakes to begin with, and then the mistakes, they disappear.
The other thing you should do if you're not very industrious is discipline yourself. And so what do you do with that? Eat 3 times a day at regular meal times. That's a good thing to practice, because that starts to put some stability into your life. Get up at the same time. I would highly recommend all those young people out there who are listening, like, you want to get a jump on life, get the hell out of bed in the morning. As I've got older, I've got up earlier and earlier. Now, that's partly because you don't need as much sleep, but it's also partly because I've got more and more disciplined. Like, get up early in the morning and get your things done. Man, learn to get up at 6 in the morning and you'll be one deadly creature, especially if you can get to work. You'll have half your damn day done by the time other people haul their sorry asses out of bed. And so that's a massive, massive advantage. Look, Warren Farrell, not the comedian, Warren Farrell, the author, he outlined data in Why Men Earn More, which is a book I would recommend, by the way, showing that if you work 13% longer hours, you make 40% more money. It's nonlinear. So you think, why is that? Well, imagine you had 10 employees and one of them works an extra 10%. It's not much. Well, how often is that person going to be promoted, assuming you have a clue as a boss? It's like you're going to look at the 10 people and you're going to think, oh, that guy's always here like 45 minutes early. It's like, why don't we give him the promotion? Obviously, right? So these small edges that you can manage like that, work an extra 10% or extra 13%, have non-proportional payoffs. That's part of the Pareto distribution. So get your sleep cycle organized so you get up in the morning. Learn how to do it. No excuses. I'm too tired in the morning. I don't like mornings. Who cares? That's not relevant. It's like discipline yourself so you can manage it. Schedule your meals, because that's a good disciplinary routine. And then learn to use a calendar, like Google Calendar. Many of you out there do not use a calendar. Okay, a calendar is not a prison, and it's not a tyrant. Not if you use it properly. A calendar keeps anxiety at bay. It makes sure that you do what you need to do, which is important, because otherwise you fall behind. But if you use it properly, it also helps you plan what you want to do. So I could say, well, lay out your damn calendar and design the days you would like to have. That's what your calendar is for. So you can put in all sorts of things in there you want to do and that would be good for you. And that's a really good way to start being more industrious. Make a plan. You need a plan for 3 years. You need a plan for the next year. You need a plan for the next 6 months. You need a plan for the next 3 months. You need a plan for the week. You need a plan for the day. You need a plan for the hour. All of that. all of that. I make lists constantly of what I have to do. And they're like daily, weekly, monthly, yearly. Right now, I can't look out more than about 6 months, because my life is too complicated and chaotic. But you need a vision of who you could be, what character you could have. 3 to 5 years out, you can't go much farther than that because life is too unpredictable, I think, to make vision that's longer term than that, subject to, there's too much chance associated with it to spend a lot of time on. Maybe you can stretch it to 5 years, and in rare cases, you can have a 10-year goal, but it has to be pretty low resolution. But you want plans at all those levels of resolution. You want to write the things down. And because what are you going to do? You're going to stumble around and get what you need? You're going to stumble around and be useful to other people? And it's useful to be useful to other people, They want to work with you then. They want to do things with you. They want to have you around. They trust you. They open up opportunities for you. And if you stumble around like you're blind, you're not going to get anywhere. And then you're going to suffer. And then you're going to be bitter. And then you're going to be cruel. So that's hell. That's a bad outcome.
The notion that our morality is linked to our desire to survive I'm perfectly fine with that. The devil's in the details to some degree. One of the fields of endeavor that I've been particularly struck by is the work of people like Frans de Waal. And Frans de Waal has written a series, and also Jaak Panksepp. Hey, I'll tell you something cool about rats. Some of you, I'd like to do that. Some of you have probably heard this before, but this affective neuroscientist named Jaak Panksepp, he studied rats for a long time, and he's a very sophisticated researcher, and I think he was one of the greatest neuroscientists who lived in the last 50 years. I don't think there's really any question of that. He might have been one of the top 3. He'd be in the top 3. It'd be a tight race up at the top 3. He did this great experiment. It was so smart. So, juvenile rats like to play. And they like to wrestle. They like to engage in rough and tumble play. And you might say, well, how do you know a rat likes to do something? It's like, or you're anthropomorphizing. And the first thing I would say to that is you should anthropomorphize unless there's evidence to the contrary. Because we share a biological platform with rats, and they're a lot like us. And a rat is a lot more like you than your stupid model of a human being is like a human being. So you try building a rat. It's hard. So anyways, you can tell rats want to play because if you put them in a little arena where they can rough and tumble play and wrestle, and then you bring them there the next time and you make them work to open the door to play, they'll work. And so that's how we know you like something. You'll work for it, so you can apply that to rats. And they'll work hard for it. And rats deprived of play, their prefrontal cortexes don't mature. And they're kind of hyperactive, which might tell us something about boys in school, but we won't go into that. If you take a rat of the same age as another rat and you put him in a play area, but the other rat has a 10% weight advantage, the big rat will pin the little rat. And they actually pin each other, pretty much like dogs do when they're wrestling. Well, they don't pin quite as much, but humans certainly do it. And pin means dominance, or that's one interpretation. You only make that interpretation if you think that the hierarchies that rats live in are dominance hierarchies predicated on the expression of power. And we all kind of think that because we use the term dominance hierarchy. But, that's a political term as well as a scientific term. And it's predicated on the notion that the fundamental basis of hierarchical structure among mammals and other complex organisms is power, and that's wrong. And it's not just wrong, it's corrosively wrong. It's misleadingly wrong. It's seriously and not acceptably wrong. Anyways, you pair the rats once and you think, hey, big rat wins over little rat, establishes dominance, that's the basis of the relationship. But the thing about rats is, like people, they don't just play once because they live in social groups that are reciprocal. They play repeatedly. And Panksepp, being a very smart researcher, realized this, so he paired rats to play, the same rats, over multiple occasions. And the first thing he observed was the second time the rats got together, the little rat had to invite the big rat to play. And rats do the same sort of thing that dogs do when they want to play. And that play behavior is so cross-species common
that all of you know when your dog wants to play. You know, you can take your dog and whack him like that if you do it right, and he goes "Rah," and tries to bite you, but not really, right? He plays and his tail's wagging, and when dogs are playing, it kind of looks like dominance behavior, like it does among boys, because boys really like to rough and tumble play, by the way, although girls like it too, but not as much. You can distinguish the play behavior from aggression, and if you can't, that means you never had any friends. I mean, no, I mean that. I mean that. That's what it means. That's what it means, because part of being able to have friends is to be able to identify aggression versus play. And part of playing is to pretend to be aggressive quite aggressively, but still be playing, right? There's a tremendous social skill in that. Anyways, the little rat has to ask the big rat to play, which I imagine is somewhat, humiliating for the little rat, but he's the little rat, so tough luck for him. And the big rat can deign to play, and then they play. And then you can observe how they play over repeated bouts. If the big rat doesn't let the little rat win at least 30% of the time, even though he could win 100% of the time, the little rat will no longer invite him to play. And you think, yeah. It's like, no, not yeah. Like the emergence of morality in rats through play. That's a big discovery, man. That's a big discovery. And there's that reciprocity, that exists within the rat hierarchy. And stable hierarchies in complex mammals are not predicated on power. So Frans de Waal has showed quite clearly that, so chimps have a pretty rough hierarchy, and it's pretty male-dominated. Now, bonobos are quite different. We won't talk about them because it's not germane to this particular point. But you might think, the biggest chimpanzee with the biggest teeth, he's the tyrant. He's the winner. And that happens sometimes. There are tyrannical chimpanzee societies. But what de Waal has shown quite clearly is that I don't care how big and tough you are. If you don't play fair, two guys 90% your size can get together one day when you're not feeling so well and tear you into bits. And that's exactly what happens among the chimps. So tyranny, that can be a route to dominance. It can even be a route to sexual access, because it is the case among chimpanzees that males who are higher in the power hierarchy are more likely to father offspring, not because the female chimps choose them, because female chimps aren't choosy, unlike human females. It's a profound difference between the two species, but because the more superordinate male chimps chase the subordinates away. So, but de Waal has shown quite clearly that the males who manage to occupy positions of authority and competence longest in chimpanzee hierarchies are intensely reciprocal with the other males, more so than the other chimps in the hierarchy. They do a lot of mutual grooming and are preferentially attentive to the females and their infants. And so even among chimps, and chimps can be damn brutal, right? Jane Goodall discovered, I think it was 1975, another landmark in late 20th century science, that, and this was a real blow to the social constructionist utopians. Juvenile chimps patrol the borders of their territory, and if they come across chimps from other troops and outnumber them, they will tear them into bits. And chimps are unbelievably strong, and it's unbelievably brutal. And so Goodall basically discovered that chimps have the human the equivalent of human tribal warfare. And that's quite frightening if you're sensible, because, you might be the kind of optimist who thinks that human conflict is caused by capitalism or some bloody daft notion like that. And wouldn't that be lovely? Because then it would be, you could just get rid of it by getting rid of capitalism, which you wouldn't be able to do anyways. But you know what I mean. We split from chimps about 7 million years ago. And if the problem of intergroup aggression is that deep, it's a terrible problem.
Because you made it this far in a video,
I want to celebrate you. Most people start and don't finish. Most people never actually follow through. Most people say they want something, but they don't ever do the work to actually get it. But you are different. You are special. Believe Nation, you made it here all the way to the end, and I love you. So as a special celebration, if you put a hashtag believe down in the comments below on this video, I will showcase you and celebrate you somewhere on the screen in a future video because you are awesome. For 10 more amazing rules from Russell Brand, check the video right there next to me. I think you'll love it. Continue to believe, and I'll see you there.
It's very easy to establish an ideal like that, isn't it? Other people's opinions of you are none of your business, and therefore I shouldn't speculate, far less care as to what other people's opinions are. Self-pity is you hold on to something you don't want.